Welcome to The Lubber's Hole, a Patrick O'Brien podcast. Not only are you with Ian
and with Mike,
but we're also going to devote this episode to an interview with our special guest, Peter Moore. Peter's a writer, journalist, and a tutor in creative writing at the University of Oxford. He's the author of 5 works of history, including the Sunday Times bestsellers, The Weather Experiment and Endeavour. And Peter, we understand you're also A, Patrick O'Brien fan, and B, author of a soon-to-be-released book, Dangerous Game, Thomas Cochrane's Life on the Edge. Peter, you're very welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Well, and I'm just climbing through the Lubber's Hole, I guess,
Indeed.
right now.
Yeah. Welcome aboard.
Nice view.
Oh, yes.
Peter, I think both of us have had an incredible time going through your advanced copy of the book. Thank you very much. It's just brilliantly done here. And I'm going to start with this so I don't forget it again. For you folks in the U.S., Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness, Britain and the American Dream, also a Peter Moore history that you absolutely need to read. I'm halfway through. I'm loving it. Thank you, Peter. Now, so you've got these great books, The Endeavour, The Weather Experiment. You've got this great thing about England's contribution to America. What drew you to Cochrane as a subject, and how did that become the next great book for you?
Well, so thank you for that. It's really a combination of everything that I've been thinking about, everything that I've been writing about for perhaps 15 years or so. When you combine them, Cochrane seems to be the character that results, in a way. My very first book, many years ago, when I was just starting out, was called Damn His Blood. It was a true crime book. It was set in 1806 in a little village in Worcestershire. And to really work out what went on in that story, I had to learn all about the Georgian criminal code. And I suppose back then I fell in love with the idea of Georgian society, of its colour and its characters and its, I suppose, enthusiasm as well, which is just like apparent to anyone who goes into the period. Then I went and wrote about the first weather forecast, which is a story set a little bit later on, but that was really the history of science. And then it was Endeavour, which was a story about the first of James Cook's expeditions to the South Seas. So this was the sea and ships and the naval culture of the High Enlightenment. Then I wrote this book about a country called the United States of America.
Right.
And how that...
Still going, is it?
Just about, yeah. And how that came to be. And that was politics. So there we go from politics to the sea to science and crime. And I think you put all those things together and you say, what character am I going to end up with? You end up with Thomas Cochrane, who was an inventor. He loved science. He was involved in a criminal case, which people are still talking about today. He's regarded as perhaps the most aggressive frigate captain in the history of the Royal Navy, certainly in the Napoleonic Wars. Just an absolutely sensational character. And yeah, I mean, why not? He's irresistible.
So, Thomas Cochrane, I can't think that there'll be anybody listening to this who doesn't know that the connection is with Jack Aubrey's avatar, if you like. The real life inspiration for Jack Aubrey was Thomas Cochrane. So there's got to be an O'Brien connection here somewhere, Peter. What got you started was reading Patrick O'Brien. Did it come after this realization, or had you been into the books? Much in?
Yeah, I suppose during O'Brien's great years of celebrity, I was quite young back then, and I remember reading Master and Commander and finding it quite tough, actually. And then I think I read a few of them around that age. This would be around the turn of the century time, and then left them completely. And when I was working on my Endeavour book, I realised that I really had to understand how ships worked. Everyone said, well, you ought to read O'Brien. O'Brien obviously explains ships better than anybody else, and he does it with a novel attached. And I thought I would. And then I think I just went through the whole lot back then, and it was this this dreamy reading experience whereby everything that didn't make sense clicked, and then once it clicked, it was just magical. And I think that's probably what everyone who gets into O'Brien says. It's a bit like you tune into his frequency after a while, because he has such a distinct voice that I think it can be quite forbidding when you're starting off. But once you're into it, it's very addictive. So yeah, that was my O'Brien thing. I love those books because, again, they captured the same thing that caught me when I was working on that first book, this Georgian society that was so rich, that was so problematic in many ways, but it was like a Labrador puppy. It was bounding around. It was full of energy. It was causing trouble. And it was very silly, but it was also very serious. It was great range, I think, in those books, but expressed with such beauty, such wit, there's some really, really funny parts in O'Brien when you think, oh, Patrick, you can't say that, or you can't do that. Oh, God, he has, and then you just find yourself chuckling on the sofa and people look at you and wonder what's going on. So yeah, I guess this is all very familiar to lots of O'Brien fans, that sensation. With the Cochrane thing, you can find, I think, the source of Master and Commander completely, almost to the sentence. There's a moment in Cochrane's autobiography, I think it's about page 109, 110 or something like that, of the first volume of his autobiography, published in 1859. And it's when the Speedy attacks El Gamo and this bizarre action happens. And I think O'Brien was obviously very taken by the fact that everyone jumps over the gunwales apart from the surgeon who stands there at the helm. And I think in that one sentence, the whole of Stephen Maturin appears and the whole of Aubrey appears. And then obviously that's the beginning, and Aubrey departs from Cochrane quite quickly afterwards. But at the beginning, that's the moment, I think.
So you focus in the book, Peter, on 1802 to 1827, rather than opening at the point we just were on. Everybody starts with the Speedy and, all the action in the Speedy. We were curious, why did you choose the time frame that you did, and what does it let you show that maybe many of the more familiar Cochrane narratives miss?
Well, first of all, I've never really liked the idea of the cradle to grave biography, which I find a very old-fashioned storytelling device, which often begins with the funeral, then loops back to the birth, and then goes through. There's always a chapter on ancestors, and you have to wade through that. And I think in terms of biography, that's very old-fashioned now, and I think it's about isolating significant portions of life, finding moments in someone's life where something really meaningful happened. So I would find it really against every instinct of mine to go back to that day in December 1775 where Thomas Cochrane was born and then just march through the years. That's not for me. Why 1802? I think there's a slight bit of O'Brien in here as well, because there is a really obvious point to start the story, which is when he got his chance on the Speedy, which is exactly where O'Brien starts and the Speedy becomes a Sophie. And I thought, O'Brien, I don't want to be accused of doing exactly the same thing. But there's something really interesting about cutting into the story in 1802, because it puts Cochrane in a slightly unusual position. He's not at sea. He's at university in Edinburgh, and he's a bit lost. He's slightly frustrated. He has a reputation. People know him for being involved in this spectacular naval event. And I just thought that's a wonderful place to catch someone in life. If you look at them and say, oh, that's the person that did that thing, you could imagine them all in this tutorial room thinking, what on earth? We're in there with a kind of Nelsonic figure, if you like. And it's only a year or so after the Gamo action, which happened on the 6th of May, 1801. And I think that date as well in Cochrane's story, the 6th of May, is an important one, because there were two incredibly important military confrontations that happened on that date. The first of which was El Gamo, which everyone knows about. The second of which happened in 1827 when he tried to lead an attack on the Acropolis in Athens during the Greek War of Independence. No one knows anything about that at all. And I thought, well, they bookend Cochrane's story wonderfully well, because really,
nice.
And it has to be said, I suppose, that Cochrane had quite a boring 1790s. He was just a midshipman. He went to America, saw a bit of the world. He managed to miss a lot of, he missed battles galore. He missed the 1st of June. He missed the Nile. He missed St. Vincent. On it went. So I suppose you could have spent the 1790s talking about the culture of the Navy and his anxieties of wanting to become a post captain, but I wanted to get right in there and find him at a moment of poise, I suppose.
Right. And lots of people who've read bits of the story of Cochrane will, like you said, there's whole tranches of it, that not only the Greek thing, we know about him going to Chile and Peru, but he served in Brazil. He did all kinds of interesting things. All of his political life doesn't really come up in the context of the O'Brien stories, but he was a real kind of force of nature. And as you said in the beginning, there's this overlap of all these interesting things, sea and politics and history and the changing society.
Science
as well. So in a couple of seconds, we need to get to the stock exchange fraud, because I think there's a huge amount for us to find out about there. But this has appeared on some of the social media channels lately. There's a bit to learn about Cochrane's contribution to the innovation in terms of weapons of war.
Well, yes and no. There's a writer called Charles Stevenson who, in the early years of the 2000s, wrote a really nice little book on Cochrane and chemical warfare. And he showed how Cochrane, as well as being someone who was actively involved in prosecuting war, he was someone who was thinking about the use of weapons and the innovative use of weapons in particular. And one of his ideas was to use sulfur dioxide as a poison gas, essentially. This has been known about. What I was really surprised to find out was that Cochrane had I suppose I should just reverse a little bit to say that while Cochrane had put proposals forward to the Admiralty and to very senior people within the British establishment, right up to the Prince Regent, about this use of weapon, it was generally seen as being morally disgusting. The idea of using chemical weapons was, too far. And so Cochrane was sworn to secrecy about this, and the weapons were not used throughout his life. And it was another 100 years, really, until the French first of all used gas, and then the Germans more famously used gas on the Western Front during the First World War. So it's a kind of weird little history or prehistory, if you like, of warfare. What I found, which just knocked my socks off, was that Cochrane had come very close to launching an attack, not only with chemical weapons, it has to be said, with a whole range of weaponry that he had spent several years devising, from smoke screens to rocket rafts to all sorts of different things, among which were chemical weapons on the United States of America during the War of 1812. And this was alluded to in a clause in a sentence in 1869 in a biography by his son. But Cochrane never, ever said anything about it. And I dug out this manuscript document in the National Records of Scotland up in Edinburgh. And he wrote with some candor about what he was going to have done had. So here we see the conditional clauses, which happily for us went into the sentence too. Had he sailed to America, he would have used all the weapons available to him. And that's been picked up as a news story recently, which is one of those what-if histories. Right.
And of course, he cut his teeth on the fire ship attack in Basque Roads, which doesn't appear in the O'Brien books, but is a brilliant story from his kind of early life.
And a brilliant beginning to this book. I mean, it really sets the scene. It's awesome.
And his dad was an inventor. When I go back into his autobiography and I read the stories of his dad kind of being taken for a bit of a ride by some of the potential investors in his inventions, I think of the story of Jack Aubrey and Kimber and the lead mines and silver. It all sounds like gentleman scientist done wrong. In the case of Jack Aubrey, because he's a bit of a foolish whore. But in the case of Cochrane, he sounds like he really wanted to do better than his dad had and not to be taken for a ride the way he thought that his father had.
Yeah, I think probably the one thing that I would want to say about this book is it's the importance of family. Okay. So often Cochrane's life is represented as a singular one of him being this complete maverick. And this is the conventional way to portray him, almost as a lunatic in history. That's how many people think about him. And what I wanted to do when I started, and you look at the cover of my book, I didn't want a portrait of Cochrane on the front. I was quite firm about that with the publishers. I didn't want to have the famous strolling portrait or the later one where there's, the fire's going off in the background. Yeah. Because to me, it's a family story, and he was a product of a very strange family who were going through a very difficult time. Yeah. And that really impacted so much of what happened during his own life story. So his father, as you said, was an incredibly formative character. He was a projector, they say. He was one of these entrepreneurs of the time, had ideas, was willing to pour money into this. All sounds very familiar to the Aubrey story, isn't it? Yeah. But it's just pouring money into schemes to get coal out of the ground. And he beggared himself really in the pursuit of these great goals. So this is a quintessential Enlightenment story of someone who got too carried away with themselves, who was deceived by their own dreams. And that was Cochrane's father, who was both very talented but very flawed. And he left his son with the most miserable inheritance, because he was, first of all, the heir to the earldom of Dundonald, which was hugely prestigious. To be an earl, that was like kind of very high up in the social rankings. But he didn't even have a seat. He lost the house, he lost the acres, he lost the money. There's a very sad letter that you find from around the time of the El Gamo action, where his father is basically living penniless just off the Oxford Road in London, and he's pawning his watches and taking loans for £50 from these shady individuals. So you can see there the texture in this story. So he's at once incredibly prominent, but money makes the world go round, and he didn't have any of it. And he was, I think, I write at the beginning of the book how his whole purpose was to restore money, but also pride and respectability to his family. Yeah. And that became such a driving impulse. And these impulses become personality traits after a while.
Right. And not uniquely among British captains at the time, but he had Thomas Cochrane, that is, had a real eye for prize money. And there are plenty of stories scattered through his life of him using ingenuity not only to win glory for the colours, but to win dollars as well.
Yeah, there's a wonderful quote from his time in Brazil, and a newspaper man wrote at the time that it's great to see Cochrane chasing after the goal of liberty, but it's interesting to see how he also has an eye on the goal of prize money. And these were two things that ran in parallel throughout his life, because he had political principles, he had convictions, and he was very keen to live by them. But he also did incredibly well out of the prize system, and he saw that as his route, or as his salvation, I guess, in a way, because at this time, the 3/8 went to the captain. This is before 1808, and they changed the prize regulations. So, there's a spectacular story. So the 1805, which people would say is probably the most famous year in the history of the Royal Navy. Well, Cochrane was not at Trafalgar shooting at Spaniards and Frenchmen. He was off the Azores earlier in the year, on the line of the 38th parallel, picking off the Havana fleet as it sailed towards Cadiz. And the money that he made over a 2 or 3 week period was extraordinary. So if you look at relatively successful frigate captains like Edward, very successful, Pellow, yeah, exactly.
Right.
Very prominent, successful. They would make about £10,000 in prize money. Cochrane made 80,000 in 3 weeks.
In that cruise.
Yeah. Wow.
And to put that into today's value would be beyond I'm sure there will be some measuring worth site that you could do, but that is an incredible sum of money. Yeah. So he went from when he went to sea, he couldn't afford his uniform. He couldn't afford the £100 for his naval uniform. That had to be borrowed money from a family friend. And he was constantly after £50 from this friend or £100 from that friend. And then all of a sudden, £80,000. So,
life-changing amounts of money, as they say on quiz shows. Yeah.
won the lottery.
Back to your comment, Peter, that it's a story of not just Cochrane, but family and friends. And it occurs to me that reading through it, there's a lot of family and friends who help him and put him in the positions for so much of this to happen. And part of that, I think, sets up, at least for me, you make the argument in the book that Cochrane was rightly convicted, but genuinely innocent. And there's some things that I think we don't want to talk about because it's just so amazing to find what you add to this history and the research and everything. But there's a lot of things that I think we can talk about that lead to that and blend this family into not this lone man and this one incident.
Yeah, I know what you're alluding to, and it's an incredible story. So I should just say for people who don't know that the big event on which the big event on which his life hinges is the 1814 conviction for a fraud by the stock exchange, which is remembered to history as a great stock exchange fraud. It sounds like the great train robbery, doesn't it? It's got a bit of a romantic air when you say it out loud. For Cochrane, it wasn't a romantic thing at all. It was the one defining misery of his life, and he spent the rest of his days after 1814, when he was convicted and jailed for a year, attempting to reestablish his innocence and to get restitution for the fines that he was having to pay to the British government. Yeah, so this obviously is the big event which confronts any Cochrane biographer. And it really, truly changes how you interpret who he was. Because if he was guilty of this crime, then even his most enthusiastic supporters say, well, it's more than a blemish. This was a severe character flaw. And we were talking about money earlier, and it shows that maybe money had come to obsess him. And there are some historians who've written very ably, I have to say, that he was someone who became cupid, he became rapacious, he was thinking first of all about money. That case has been made repeatedly by many people. On the other side, there's Cochrane's own explanation that it was a great sting against him, that he was brought down for his political opinions. And I guess those are the two different schools of thought about it. And, there has been good work done, I have to say. But for me, there was a different way to look at this. And it has always bothered me for years that no one had really looked into the life story of Andrew Cochrane Johnson, who was his youngest uncle. So he was from a family with a defective father, if you like. That's maybe a bit crass, but you know what I mean. But his father came from a line of 7 or 8 brothers. The youngest of them, and perhaps the most talented, was called Andrew Cochrane. And he was an MP, at the age of 23. He was an army man. He rose through the ranks really quickly in the 1790s. He had an exciting 1790s where Cochrane was having a boring one. His was really exciting. And because he was that little bit older than Cochrane, I think he became a surrogate father figure, or just like that, the elder brother that he needed. And I'm glossing over things which are really important here, but I realise I can't go on forever. But Cochrane modified his name to Andrew Cochrane Johnson when he became the governor of Dominica. And by this point, he was rising into a position of real power and prominence in the British Empire. And he'd had this tremendous rise, but as soon as he rose, he fell. And there was a mutiny that he was involved in on Dominica, which precipitated his recall. And he was then eventually chucked out of the army. And after that became a very strange, adventuring character. He was always coming up with schemes, none of which really worked out for him, but schemes on the most ridiculous scale of involving huge amounts of money. And so it was this Andrew Cochrane Johnson who was tried alongside him, the stock exchange fraud. And, what has been done on him before, I just felt hadn't really worked out the depth of the relationship between the two. And so a lot of the book, I have to say, is about Andrew Cochrane Johnson as well as Thomas Cochrane. Yeah. And I think his story is absolutely extraordinary. And that once you understand who Andrew Cochrane Johnson was, you understand who Thomas Cochrane was, but you understand why 1814 went exactly the way it did and how Cochrane found himself almost in a moral prison, and it became a story which he couldn't tell himself, I believe, because he felt unable to do that, and he was never able to speak about this for the rest of his life. And so in a way, I think, like, I've tried to give life back to the true story from the original documents, not from the autobiography, but go back right to the beginning.
Right.
I think a lot of Andrew Cochrane Johnson's papers have been destroyed, but there's enough left that becomes evidence, I think.
So there are revelations in the book that people are going to have to read the book to get the specifics on, and it's absolutely worth it. A couple of moments that I would describe as marmalade dropper moments. There must have been some moments when you were doing your research, Peter, like when you realized, this is where the reality of the story's heading. How did that feel compared to other bits of research and investigation you'd done?
Yeah, there were a couple. There was certainly a couple of those where you think you're getting somewhere and then something just pops up and down goes the marmalade. I have to say, I'm sure she'll be listening to this, so I have to mention Petra. He's been such a great help with me as I've been going through this, because often, every other book I've written, I've just been on my own in this kind of weird world of the past, and I don't talk to anyone about it, and it's just me. But I had this kind of great stroke of fortune that there was one other person who was as weirdly obsessed with Cochrane as I was. So Petra Karbach, who's probably listening to this now.
Oh, Petra, friend of the show.
Yeah, exactly.
From the very beginning.
She's a real scholar, and she knows Cochrane's life so well.
Yeah.
And I was able to, I suppose, test my ideas out on her. We don't agree on everything, of course, but it was just so great to have that person to talk to. And I think as a good historian, you've got to be skeptical. You've got to look for evidence. You can't have it the wrong way around, where you're trying to put evidence to a theory. That the evidence has got to create the theory. That's like absolutely fundamental to any trained historian will tell you this. I had a sense that Cochrane Johnson was the key. And I suppose it felt to me like I picked the right fork to go down. And let me tell you this, there's three things in particular in Cochrane's story which no one's spotted before, which I think are absolutely of critical value to understanding the stock exchange fraud. And I won't go into them at the moment for obvious reasons, but they are just fundamental to understanding what was going on then. And I suppose it was a case of a picture assuming shape. That's the only way I can describe it. And I've never worked on a book that was quite like that before. I've done books with clever structures before. I've done books where you can play with character, play with an argument even, but where it felt like a breaking news story, and it was happening 200 years later, but it felt like it was a news story. And that's why it did feel like such an exciting project.
Wow. Well, it certainly reads that way as well. You haven't told it that way. You've told us what you found and you told us what it means. But boy, that was my sense. This was, to me, reading great history and reading a great novel at the same time, because it's really got into the characters and things that I, regardless of what I'd heard and read before, had never seen before, did not understand before.
Yeah. I think in all my books, I try and write them like novels, if you like. And I don't see why you shouldn't. Just because it's nonfiction doesn't mean it can't be narrative. And I talk to students about this all the time. It's the whole excitement of my academic life, is trying to tell stories in exciting ways that engage the reader. And so you can use all the devices that a novelist can use, which are perspective, structure, realization. You've got to be very, very careful to make sure that your research is as good as it can be, and everything stands up. And if you're maybe like moving from the analysis of a document to the depiction of a scene, that you're very clear about your use of language. I think all of these things are part of what O'Brien would call the craft. That's what he used to call it. But that's where I think a story gains its emotional power. And I think this is a story with a lot of that. And, you know, it was authentic. It was organic, because I was learning this as I was going on. So it didn't feel forced. I mean, I found out it's quite incredible to say this really, but the one last piece of the jigsaw I found on my last day in the National Records of Scotland. I got one last box up because I had another half an hour before the train was going to take me back down south. I looked in this box, which had a very nondescript title, And that is the story which ended up in the Sunday Times a few weeks ago. And
Nice.
It's just weird how it happened, but it did feel like I just had the wind behind me, I suppose.
Amazing.
Maybe.
Amazing.
Love it.
So, and by the way, again, I think your excitement and perspective in telling the story really shines through as well. I can all get the sense of how you've enjoyed and relished kind of bringing the story together. You mentioned the autobiography of Cochrane a couple of times. I think lots of people have read it. I've read it through a number of times. And I think I heard you say in one of our conversations before the show, perhaps you could treat it less as a straightforward memoir and more of a kind of protracted campaign of self-defense.
Yeah, well, you have to remember that ever since 1814, Cochrane had been producing polemical pamphlets which were designed to show his innocence. Yeah. And so that was very much his mode of thinking by the time that the autobiography came out. And then if you add that together with the fact that he was in his early 80s, that he was doing this through the aegis of a ghostwriter, and you can see how some very peculiar mistakes went through. It's such a complicated document, the autobiography, because it's so full of good information. Yeah. But, it's the source of much myth as well. And it's the source of, there's some, very strange errors of chronology. Yeah. There's all sorts of errors with it. I mean, I have to say this, though, and I don't want to just be down on the autobiography because it's an easy thing for me to do, because I think it's, in a way, brilliant. But let me tell you this as well. The first volume is, when it came out, it was universally admired. People thought that this was the first time people had read about El Gamo and the Speedy. This was the first time people had read about the Rosas thing and about the corvettes and about all of these wonderful, about the Minerve, these famous tussles, which are legend in naval law. That all went into the first biography, and it ended just after the Battle of Basque Roads in 1809. So the public were left for a year in the highest pitch of suspense. And then what Dundonald did for the second volume, which was released a fortnight or so before he died in 1860, was treat it as the last battleground. And when people read the proofs, this is when the next Lord Cochrane, so this would be his, let's work this out, this would be his son, I guess, read the proofs for the second volume. He sent it to the family lawyer. The family lawyer wrote back saying, this will be the most injurious suicidal publication you could possibly make. It should be stopped immediately. Because what he does in the second volume of his autobiography is lay out his case of the conspiracy, which begins with Lord Ellenborough, the trial judge, which then rolls down to all the members of the naval establishment. It includes all of the attacks on Gambier and so on. All of this is belligerent, it's angry, and
score settling as well as...
He's just settling scores, exactly. And had it not been for that second volume, I think he would have been remembered quite differently. And it's fair to say that it poisoned his reputation among many members of the British scholarly elite who have never forgiven him, really, down to this day, for what he wrote about the judge, about Farrar, the solicitors who he basically accused of siding against him. And so this whole idea of Cochrane being a fabulist and being mendacious can be isolated to this short period of time. And there's a wonderful, in the archives, a wonderful sequence of letters which are written in the most appalling handwriting. So it took an age to work them out. But they came from this family solicitor. And he was reading them on the Monday, on the Tuesday, on the Wednesday, and they're all dated from Paris, and they were being sent back to London saying, you can't do this, you can't do this. Someone should stop him. But there's a wonderful quote he also has about Dundonald, and he says, this is Cochrane, he says, he's a very awkward man to lead or advise, and that gives you an idea of his. He's probably one of the most stubborn characters in modern British history. But yeah, that's where that all comes from.
I'm going to wonder aloud whether how many people might have said the same thing about Patrick O'Brien.
Yeah. Well, O'Brien read the autobiographies.
He certainly did.
Although he did a lot of research, I have to say, for the reverse of the medal, which is the one that deals with the stock exchange.
Peter, we should talk some more about sources, but before we do that, let's take a quick break and we'll be right back.
Peter, you had extraordinary access to, I think, a lot of documents and sources that other biographers perhaps have not had. Can you say, without necessarily going into some of what you've found, say what that was, as well as any change that made in your understanding of Cochrane?
Good question. Yeah, I think so. Biographers, in particular, there was one in the 1970s that did a lot of work on the papers. So I wasn't the first person to get access to the private papers, which are in Edinburgh. They are there. I think it's more the way that you can get at them nowadays. Not every Cochrane biographer has gone beyond the autobiography, it has to be said. There are some which rely very heavily on that. And I guess that the digitization projects of recent times have just made things much more easy to get to. So Cochrane's private archive is kept in the National Records of Scotland, and it's massive. It's huge. It's, I guess, about 20,000 papers or something like that.
Wow.
There was a bit of a job to go through that. And, wonderful things for O'Brien fans in there. There's the original log of the Speedy, which you can find in there. There's the Palace's log and things. They're all salt stained and watermarks on them. So they've got that aura of the battle. But yeah, I mean, beyond that, Nikolai Tolstoy, Patrick O'Brien's stepson, I spent a lot of time talking to him about Cochrane and Patrick, which was a huge help. The newspapers have just been completely revelatory in allowing you to access what people thought in the moment. I'm, maybe not that old, but I've been doing this long enough to remember having to go to Colindale in North London and get the original broadsheet newspapers brought up one by one, whereas the British Newspaper Archive does away with all of that now. And because Cochrane was such a figure in journalism, they're actually a really useful resource for you measuring what was going on from day to day. And yeah, just having the time to go through the boxes, the Earl of Dundonald. Today, number 15, Dougie has been so wonderfully helpful throughout. There's other members of the Cochrane family now who've shared private stories. I won't mention them as we're talking because they don't always like to appear in public. But yeah, there's some who live quite close to me. We've got wonderful private archives. There's a picture of Cochrane, which has never been seen by anyone ever before. I'm going to hold it up for you. You can see. So this is Midshipman Cochrane. Can you see?
Goodness.
Wow.
He's a handsome lad.
Wow.
So that's never
No whiskers either.
never been published before.
But it's in the book, I should say.
And this is your book. It's showing it.
Yeah, so that's in the plate section. And when I started, I had the same family. They have a little, it's like a little shot glass, but a collapsible one, which is kind of telescopic thing almost. And this is apparently what Cochrane used to have a shot of whiskey out of before he went into action. And I went over and I was saying, would you like to have a shot of whiskey out of this? And out it came. And this was right at the beginning. So having this access to the tangible mementos of the time is a magical thing, really. And there's a lot about him that survives. And I would always, for people who do want to look at Cochrane's life, go beyond the autobiography, which is one thing, but he's so mythologized. There's so many strange stories about him. This started in his life when he came back from South America. This is in 1825, if my brain's working correctly. He had to start squashing the stories himself. The first one that he said was untrue was about that he'd presented a dagger called the Dagger of Montezuma to Walter Scott, which had been given to him by a tribal chief in Peru. He said that was rubbish. There was another story that Lady Cochrane, his wife, had shot a highwayman with a pistol on the road outside Callao, and he said that wasn't true either. But this began a trend with Cochrane that because he was so outlandish, because he was so extreme, that he did the most ridiculous things, many of which did happen, He did actually take Valdivia with one ship that was sinking. That did actually happen.
Wow.
But people would say there was a dog at Basque Roads that was rescued at the last moment before the explosion. And that was completely false. This idea, the one that I think is the strangest of all, is this adoption of the sea wolf as the moniker of Cochrane. People almost immediately say to me, the sea wolf Cochrane, it's right there at the top of his Wikipedia page. But I just couldn't find any evidence for this claim at all. This has been the title of books about Cochrane. But the first time anyone calls Cochrane the sea wolf is in a bookseller's, this is as far as I could establish, it was in a bookseller's advert for the autobiography in 1859. So the argument is that Napoleon called him Le Loup de Mer, which is a sea wolf. So this first claim comes, decades after Napoleon died in St. Helena. And Cochrane doesn't make it himself in his autobiography. It doesn't appear in any of the early biographies about him. It's only really picked up in the 1940s when a short book about Cochrane was published by an author whose name escapes me now. But now if you go onto YouTube and type in Thomas Cochrane, it is the craziest naval officer in history, the Sea Wolf. And that's just emblematic, really, of how his story has spiraled and it's deepened and it's become more peculiar, and you get these fossilized areas which have come into it. So I tried to treat it as a serious historical prospect and just go and find the source for everything. And there's 100 pages of endnotes. So yeah, you can check me out.
Okay. There's another connection that I want to pick up on. And I'm not sure, I believe this might have been the creation of Cochrane himself, this idea that Nelson said, never mind maneuvers, always go at them, which is objectively not how Nelson fought many of his actions. But it appears attributed to Nelson, I think, in Cochrane's autobiography. I don't know of anywhere else. But let's just talk about Nelson for a minute, because that's a connection. Nelson himself had originally been this dashing frigate captain. You mentioned that Cochrane wasn't actually around at Trafalgar. And I wonder whether, like Aubrey, Cochrane really wished that he had been. How close do we think the connection was in real life between Nelson and Cochrane himself?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question. I suppose Nelson just became a barometer for people to measure themselves against. Yeah. And he became such a celebrity. He won such important battles. He was loved by the British. I mean, when him and Pitt died within weeks of each other, it was like, I think it's this really strange emotional climate which settled on Britain. This idea that you could have a Churchill and a Montgomery die, or whatever it would be. Yeah. I'm trying to find a clunky World War II analogy, but that they just go in one moment. And I think Cochrane at that time, because his career does obviously overlap with Nelson's, but because really Cochrane hadn't achieved much apart from El Gamo until the time of Trafalgar, he then emerges as someone who becomes the new kid, the nation's new hope, the replacement, if you like. So a lot of people's ideas about how to look at a naval hero were grafted from Nelson onto Cochrane. And so there were lots of things they had in common. There was the clever seamanship, the way they were beloved by their crews. There was the artfulness, the tricks, all of these things that people think about with a smile, the false flags, the disguised paintwork. Cochrane was, in fact, more that than Nelson was. And where they differed was in one important regard, because Nelson did win these huge fleet battles. I mean, he did run over the ships at St. Vincent. He did Trafalgar, and Cochrane didn't. And I think this is that lack of a clarifying victory has probably left him in many people's minds much inferior to Nelson, because when you talk about the strategic battles which really make a difference, it's generally people are thinking about the big fleet actions. Cochrane was involved in one, which was off the coast of Brazil in 1823, and it didn't go particularly well. I mean, his explanation was that the Brazilian crews that he were leading, they were crews of all sorts, really. They weren't really up to the job, and it all turned into a bit of an embarrassing fiasco. And I guess, did he want to be Nelson? I think he would have liked to have had that victory. That would have been a real feather in his cap. But what he was, though, and this is where the Sea Wolf is appropriate, because even though it might not be historically accurate, it is absolutely accurate in describing what kind of fighter he was. And that's maybe why it has stuck so well. Yeah. He operated on his own. He often liked to strike at night. There was something ruthless about him, something deadly. Yeah, and so in military history, I think that's the way he's still considered.
So, Peter, we've talked about how your time frame for your book is 1802 to 1827, and how this covers so much of the really important character forming and revelatory moments about Cochrane's life and the story that you found for us to learn. There was somebody else whose work and professional life was at a peak between 1802 and 1827. In Vienna, a long way away from the attentions of Jack Aubrey and Stephen Maturin, was the composer Beethoven. Now, I've heard a piece of audio that you've had put together, and in a couple of seconds, we're going to hear a clip of it. Can you tell us a bit about what's in it and how you came to do this nice Beethoven-Cochrane mashup?
Well, I can't claim too much credit for this, to be honest, but because what happened, so the book begins, it has to begin, the obvious place to begin is with a bang, with a bang. And well, there's a big bang in Cochrane's story, and it happened in 1809 at Basque Road, so I thought, well, I'll start with that particular bang. And it is very cinematic. You have the dark night, the howling wind, the fire ships, the French fleet lying at their mercy, and it is all very dramatic. And because audio now is a huge form of storytelling, and I'm sure you all listen to audiobooks as much as you read. And we were just talking with among ourselves, and I said, well, I'll read out the prologue. And then this came back to me with Beethoven as a musical bed beneath. So it's really amped up to the maximum. So you have this dramatic Basque. It is quite Beethoven-ish Basque Roads. I'm not sure which other musician would do Basque Roads better. It's a Beethoven place, I think. Really.
Let's take a listen.
Prologue. Explosion. Off the Ile decks, Rochefort, Bay of Biscay. The sailors aboard HMS Impérieuse did not see the sunset on the 11th of April 1809. All that day the sky had been covered from rim to rim with iron grey clouds. A gusty Atlantic wind, meanwhile, had driven down from the north. It brought hours of rain that fell continuously over the sodden decks of the 38-gun frigate. Thomas Cochrane, the Impérieuse's captain, had brought his ship deep into Rochefort Bay, close to the Boyart Shoal on the fringes of the Basque Roads anchorage, at 5 o'clock that afternoon. It was very dirty, recalled one sailor, and blowing strong. There was just enough light left to enable those aboard the Impérieuse to pick out the seaward edge of the Ile decks 2 miles away. As the last smudges of...
Yeah, I mean, Egmont, such a dramatic story. I think Egmont was written, or at least Beethoven's incidental music was written in 1809, 1810, something like that. So it's right in the era. Is it
really?
So,
wow, okay.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, no, I'm glad I found one of your passions as well.
Oh, wow. So thank you for drawing me there. You asked who else besides Beethoven might have done it. I'm going to go on a limb and say Hector Berlioz, who was the next romantic nutcase along after Beethoven.
Okay.
But
we could try that.
Yeah, we could.
Or maybe the Rolling Stones if we're going a bit later.
Oh, right.
Some kind of gritty bit of maybe.
Yeah, give me shelter.
Well, I was going to say, playing at Altamont.
There we go. Yeah. Please send suggestions.
Do your own mashup. This is made. There must be some kind of TikTok thing we can. Anyway, never mind.
Nice.
Excellent. And that's going to be part of the audiobook as well. That then brings us to the question of the launch, I guess. Tell us about the launch of the new book and how's it going?
Well, not far to go now, so it's exciting to be talking to you about this. I'm hopefully going to talk to other people about Cochrane soon, and it will be wonderful to see what people make of what I think about him.
Yeah.
We're going to have a launch party at Dr. Johnson's house in a few weeks' time, and that will be, I think, a special occasion which brings a lot of the Patrick O'Brien people, right, because he's, of course, part of the Cochrane story and the Cochrane family members, but also, writers and historians, all those. So it'll be, for me, an exciting and quite unique moment, I think, and a great gathering of people. And really, when you write a book, it's strange, like sending your child off to the nursery school after you've done all the hard work of getting them to that point. And then all of a sudden, they're not yours anymore. They belong to other people. So for me, happy to talk to people about Cochrane. I'd love to hear. He's a wonderful subject. He's an incredible man. He's an inspiration. He lives in fiction, but he lives in our world as well. So yeah, there are people who know lots about Cochrane, so it'd be great to talk to them about him. But for me, it's new projects and new horizons. A bit like Jack Aubrey, it's the end of a book, and then he gets a letter from the Admiralty, and then you're off again, and you don't know what's going to happen next.
Well, speaking of what's going to happen next, Peter, I guess I've got a double question, as I always do here. What else are you up to? Because you're up to a lot from what we see. And what perhaps is your next project?
Well, I just like to be sure. I'm not sure about books. I love this period. It's the best part of English history as far as I'm concerned, because it's far enough away to feel quite remote to us, but it's well enough documented that you can reconstruct it. And you can reconstruct it as a historian, not just as a novelist. And so newspapers, letters, this was a great age of letter writing, of course, the great prose stylists. So it's a playground for me and a pleasure to be writing about it. Whether I can find anything up to Cochrane and that level, I don't know. So I'm going to have a think. There's a few ideas I'm not going to tell you about today, but I'm pondering them. I edit a website called Unseen Histories, which is about new history books, which is great journalism. There's a podcast I do called Travels Through Time, which keeps me talking to people about things, even when I'm working on my own. So we've done one with Andrea Wolfe recently. There was one on Alexander the Great with Edmund Richardson, one with Catherine Osler on the Renoir Girls. So it's a great, it could be anything, but that's my podcasting, I suppose. And then I've got all my teaching at Oxford, which is completely different, because lots of people writing memoir, or they might be writing science or journalism or true crime or whatever. But my goal with them is really just to help them write the story in ways which are creative but faithful. And it's a nice mix, I'd say. Yeah, it's a really lovely mix.
Nice. Well, we'll put a link out there too. You mentioned Unseen Histories, and there's a great conversation with Nicholas Tolstoy that I think every Lover's Hole fan would love to listen to. A very private life about our favorite author. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, he talks about Patrick really tenderly, I think. And what I would say because a lot of people just want the novels, they don't want the author. They say, well, I don't care about the man. And O'Brien was so private and so dismissive of anyone who tried to ask personal questions, which he saw as an affront. But I thought it was worth doing a little bit of poking around myself, because after all, he did write the biography of Joseph Banks, and he did write about Picasso. And we do want to know about the person who wrote these wonderful books and what kind of man that he was. And Nikolai he's one of perhaps 2 or 3 people who did know Patrick at that really, really close level. So yeah, go and have a listen. It's a really nice conversation.
Fantastic.
It is.
And before we get done, Peter, tell us launch dates. When can we expect to see the book let's go with the US and the UK for now.
Well, it's going to be published on the 3rd of September. Not long to go, and I don't know what more to say than that. Then it goes into, it's like you turn up at the bridge with your little paper boat and you throw it into the water and you see what happens. That's what happens next, I think.
Well, it's a fantastic read. I'm not going to say good luck, because it doesn't need it. It's a really, really great achievement, and we hope that you get, everything that the book and that your work deserves. It's been really fantastic to get a little early insight into it. And Peter, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been lots of fun talking about Cochrane and O'Brien and all things related, and we hope our paths will cross again one day. So thank you for joining us on The Lover's Hole. Mike, where do you think we might be going next?
Well, I think we'll be right back into Desolation Island, picking back up. I think last time we heard Bondin making the same argument that Peter made about Jack Aubrey being this incredible dashing frigate captain. And he was, of course, talking about Thomas Cochrane. And we'll see where that goes as they head back out into the Southern Ocean.
I like the sound of that, Mike. I might even steal a phrase and say, I should like that of all things. Peter, once again, thanks very much indeed. It's been great to have you with us.
Thank you very much, Ian. Thank you, Mike. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for being so kind about the book. Thank you.